My friendship with Chloe was one of the great unexpected joys of my later life. I was a retired children's librarian, a woman whose days were a quiet, orderly rhythm of gardening, reading, and long, companionable walks with my husband, Paul. Chloe was a vibrant, fiercely intelligent art historian in her mid-30s. It's a whirlwind of creative energy who had moved to our small historic town of Concord, Massachusetts, a few years ago. I had met her at a library fundraiser. We had bonded over a shared, passionate love for obscure children's book illustrators, and a beautiful, unlikely friendship had blossomed. She was the daughter I had never had, and I, in many ways, had become the local surrogate mother she had left behind in another state. Our weekly lunch was a sacred ritual. We always met at the same small, sun-drenched cafe in the center of town, cozy place that smelled of old books and fresh-baked scones. Today she was radiant, her face possessing that unique, luminous glow that belongs only to women who are happily and very visibly pregnant. She was 8 months along, and her excitement was a palpable, infectious energy. "Okay, so the nursery is officially painted," she announced, her hands fluttering with excitement as she described the exact perfect shade of sage green. "And we finally, after months of debate, have a name." "Oh, darling, that's wonderful," I said, my heart filled with a genuine, uncomplicated happiness for her. "I know how much you've been agonizing over it." "It was the hardest decision of my life," she said dramatically. "I wanted something that was classic, but not common. Something strong and beautiful and magical. And we found it." She leaned forward, her eyes shining with the momentous gravity of her secret. "I wanted you to be the first person we told. Before we even tell my mom." The gesture, so full of love and a special shared intimacy, touched me deeply. "Honored, Chloe," I said. She took a deep breath, her hands resting on her round belly. "Okay, are you ready?" she squealed. "It's Serafina." The name, when it left her lips, did not register as a word. It was a physical blow, was a sound that seemed to travel through the cheerful, sunlit air of the cafe and strike me squarely in the chest, knocking all the air from my lungs. The world around me, the gentle clinking of silverware, the low murmur of other conversations, the sound of the espresso machine hissing, it all just stopped. It dissolved into a roaring, white silence, the sound of a 40-year-old wound being torn open. I was no longer in a cafe in Concord in the autumn of 2025. I was in a cold, sterile, and silent hospital room. In the spring of 1985, the year I was pregnant with my daughter was the most joyful of my life. I was 28 years old, and my husband, Paul, and I had been trying for a child for 5 long, heartbreaking years. When I finally saw the positive result on the pregnancy test, the joy was so profound, so overwhelming. It felt like the world itself had shifted on its axis, tilting towards the sun. The pregnancy was a dream. I was healthy. I was happy. Felt a deep, primal sense of purpose that I had never known before. Paul was a doting, anxious, and completely besotted father-to-be. He would read to my growing belly at night, his deep, gentle voice a rumbling lullaby. Our small, quiet life, a life of 2 academics who lived in a world of books, suddenly filled with a new, vibrant, and thrilling story. Our story, we spent months preparing the nursery. It was a small room at the back of our first house, a room that had once been my study. We painted the walls a soft, buttery yellow. Paul, a professor of classical literature, painted a mural on one wall, a beautiful, whimsical scene of characters from Greek mythology, all rendered as gentle, friendly animals. A wise old owl for Athena, strong, gentle lion for Hercules, and We chose her name. We found it in an old leather-bound book of mythology I had been reading. Seraphina from the Seraphim. It's the highest order of angels. The ones with 6 wings who flew closest to the throne of God. It was a name that sounded like a piece of music. It was a name full of hope, of grace, of a fierce, fiery beauty. It was the perfect name for the daughter who was about to become the center of our universe. The last few weeks were a state of blissful, suspended anticipation. Our house was filled with the tiny, perfect objects of a new life. A hand-carved wooden cradle, a stack of freshly washed baby clothes. Ah, a small silver rattle a friend had given us. Our life was a before, and we were standing on the precipice of the after. The labor began on a beautiful, crisp morning in early April. The first few hours were exactly as the books had described, a slow, rhythmic building of intensity. Paul was a perfect partner, calm, supportive, and completely in awe of the profound, mysterious work my body was doing. But then something shifted. The rhythm broke. The pain, which had been purposeful and productive, became something else. Sharp and wrong. I saw a flicker of concern on the nurse's face. I heard a change in the steady, rhythmic beeping of the fetal heart monitor. The sound became slower, fainter. The rest is a blur, a chaotic, terrifying montage of fear. The doctor's face suddenly grim. The urgent, hushed voices. The sudden rush of nurses into the room. Feeling of being wheeled quickly down a long white hallway. The cold, bright, and utterly impersonal light of the operating room. And then silence. The next thing I remember is waking up in a quiet, dimly lit recovery room. The intense, overwhelming pain of the labor was gone, replaced by a dull, empty ache. Paul was sitting in a chair beside my bed. His face, when I saw it, was the face of a man who had just returned from a war he had lost. His eyes were red-rimmed, his skin was pale, and his expression was one of such profound, soul-shattering grief that my own heart seemed to stop. "Paul," I whispered, my voice a dry, unused thing. "Where is she? Is she okay?" He took my hand, his own hand cold and trembling. He didn't speak. He just shook his head, a single, slow, and utterly devastating movement. And then he began to sob. A raw, broken sound that was the sound of our entire world ending. She was gone. Our daughter, our beautiful, longed-for, and deeply loved daughter, was gone before she had ever truly arrived. There had been a complication, an abruption of the placenta, a sudden, silent, and completely unavoidable tragedy. They brought her to me later. A nurse, her face a mask of professional sympathy, carried her in, wrapped in a soft, white blanket. She was so small, so perfect. It had a full head of dark, curly hair and my nose, and Paul's long, elegant fingers. She was not a dream. She was real. But she was silent. Still, we held her for an hour, the only hour we would ever have with our child. We wept. We memorized her face. We told her the story of how we had waited for her, of the nursery with the mythological animals, of the life we had dreamed for her. And we gave her her name. "Her name is Seraphina," I whispered, my lips brushing the cool, soft skin of her forehead. It was no longer a name of hope. It was a name of remembrance. A name for an angel who had flown too close to this world and then had flown away again. The days that followed were a landscape of pure, unadulterated grief. The journey home from the hospital was the worst. We walked back into our small, quiet house and into the beautiful, perfect, and now screamingly empty nursery. The yellow walls, the whimsical mural, the tiny, untouched cradlelet was all a monument to a future that had been stolen from us. We had a small, private burial in a quiet corner of the Old Town Cemetery. It's a tiny, perfect stone of white marble, engraved with a single name and a single, heartbreaking date. Serafina, April 12th, 1985. In the 40 years since that day, I'd learned to live with the grief. It was no longer a raw, open wound. It had become a part of me, a quiet, somber room in the house of my heart, a room I kept locked, a room I rarely entered, but it was always there. The ghost of the daughter I had held for only an hour. Echo of her beautiful, perfect, and unspoken name, Eleanor. "Are you okay?" Chloe's voice, full of a bright, cheerful concern, pulled me, gasping, back across the chasm of 40 years. I was back in the sunlit cafe. My teacup was rattling in its saucer, my hands shaking with the force of the memory I had just relived. "You?" "Went completely pale," she said, her brow furrowed with worry. Do you not like the name?" I looked at her, at my dear, sweet, and completely oblivious young friend. Ha! I looked at her so full of the same innocent, joyful anticipation that I had once had. And I knew that my quiet, locked room was about to be broken open. So she prompted again, a small, hopeful smile on her face. "What do you think, Serafina? Isn't it the most beautiful name you have ever heard?" I looked at her, the ghost of my own daughter standing between us, and I opened my mouth. First, painful and long overdue word of my oldest, most sacred, and most heartbreaking story about to be spoken. The world, which had dissolved into a roaring white silence, slowly, painfully, began to resolve itself back into the mundane reality of the cafe. I could hear the clinking of a fork against a plate at a nearby table. I could smell the rich, bitter scent of coffee. And I could see the face of my friend, Chloe, her expression of bright, happy expectation slowly curdling into one of confused, slightly impatient concern. "Eleanor," she said, her voice pulling me back across the 40-year chasm of my memory. "You completely zoned out. Are you okay?" "You look like you've just seen a ghost." "I have," I thought. "I've just seen mine." I tried to speak, to form a sentence, to say it's a beautiful name, the polite, socially required lie, but the name itself was a fishbone caught in my throat. I couldn't say it. The muscles in my jaw wouldn't obey. All I could manage was a small, almost imperceptible shake of my head. Chloe's brow furrowed. You don't like it?" she asked, a note of wounded, childish disbelief in her voice. "But it's perfect. It's so unique, Serafina." Hearing her say it again was a fresh blow, a second twist of the knife. I felt the carefully constructed dam of my 40-year grief begin to crack. And I knew with a sudden, terrifying certainty that if I stayed in this bright, cheerful public place for one more second, I was going to completely and humiliatingly fall apart. "Chloe," I said, my voice a ragged, unfamiliar whisper. I began to gather my things, my movements clumsy, my hands shaking. "I'm so sorry. I can't talk about this here." "Talk about what?" she asked, her confusion now mixed with a clear, rising tide of irritation. It's a name. "Eleanor, what is there to talk about?" "Please," I begged, my eyes pleading with hers. "Just come home with me. Come back to my house. I'll explain everything. Please." She stared at me, at the raw, undisguised pain on my face. And the irritation in her expression finally softened into a reluctant concern. She nodded. "Ah." Single, jerky movement. The walk from the cafe back to my old historic house on the edge of town was the longest 3 blocks of my life. We walked in a tense, awkward silence. Chloe was, I could feel, deeply annoyed. Her happy announcement. having been hijacked by my strange, inexplicable melodrama. And I was in a state of quiet, internal panic, trying to find the words, the courage, to unearth a body I had buried a lifetime ago when we stepped into the quiet, book-lined sanctuary of my home. The silence felt different. It was no longer peaceful. It was heavy with the weight of the story I was about to tell. I led her into the living room, the heart of my home, a room filled with comfortable, well-loved furniture and a lifetime of collected stories. "Sit down, darling," I said, my voice still trembling. "Let me make you some tea." I needed a moment, a simple domestic task to anchor me. As I stood in my kitchen waiting for the kettle to boil, my hands gripping the cool, smooth stone of the countertop, I was still wrestling with the choice. I could still lie, could invent some flimsy, plausible reason for my reaction. I could tell her the name belonged to a cruel great-aunt or a character in a book I hated. I could protect her from my truth. But what would be the cost of that? Lie. I would have to hear that name for the rest of my life. I would have to see it embroidered on blankets, to write it on birthday cards, to call a beautiful, innocent little girl by the name that was, for me, a synonym for the deepest, most profound loss a human being can experience. I would have to endure 1,000 tiny paper cuts for the sake of her comfort. And I knew, with a sudden, fierce clarity, that I was too old, too tired for that kind of quiet, lifelong self-immolation. She was my friend. She was like a daughter to me. And our friendship, if it was real, had to be strong enough to hold the weight of this truth. I brought the tea into the living room and sat in the armchair opposite her. "Chloe," I began, my voice now steady, fortified by my resolve, "I need to tell you a story. It's a story I have not told to more than a handful of people in my entire life. But I need you to hear it so you can understand." I saw her shift uncomfortably, a flicker of impatience in her eyes. She wanted to be talking about her joy, about her baby, about her name. Not this, not a sad old story from an old woman to tell the story. I knew I needed more than words. I needed evidence. I stood up and went to my library, to a high, dusty shelf in the back corner, a shelf I had not touched in years. I retrieved a small, simple, and unadorned wooden box. It was a box my husband, Paul, had made for me a lifetime ago. It was not a jewelry box. It was a reliquary. I brought the box back to the living room and sat down, placing it on the coffee table between us. I took a deep, shuddering breath and I opened it. The contents were sparse, pathetic even. A tiny, yellowed hospital bracelet. The name "Baby Girl" read typed on it in a faded mechanical font. A small, almost translucent lock of dark, baby-fine hair tied with a piece of blue ribbon. Single, small, and impossibly soft knitted white cap. Okay? And at the bottom, a single, faded Polaroid photograph. I took out the photograph and handed it to Chloe. It was a picture of me and Paul, taken 40 years ago. We were in a hospital bed. We were so young, our faces pale and puffy with a grief so immense it seemed to suck all the light and color out of the room. And in my arms, wrapped in a white blanket, was a small, perfect, and deeply, eternally still baby girl. Chloe stared at the photograph, her own hand flying to her mouth, a soft, horrified gasp escaping her lips. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Eleanor, I didn't know you had a child." I did," I said, my voice a near whisper. "For an hour. And then, for the first time in my life, to a person who was not my husband or my therapist, I told the story of Serafina. I told her everything. I told her about the years of trying to get pregnant, of the quiet monthly heartbreak, I told her of the joy, the pure, unadulterated elation of the positive pregnancy test. I described the 9 months of blissful, hopeful waiting, of painting the nursery, of choosing the name from the Book of Angels. A name that was a promise, a prayer. I told her of the birth, of the long, difficult labor, of the sudden, terrifying shift in the room, of the doctor's grim, quiet faces, of the silence, the terrible, absolute, an unnatural silence where a baby's first cry should have been. And I told her about the hour that followed, the hour I had held my daughter in my arms. She was perfect. Chloe, I wept. The memory as raw and as real as if it were yesterday. She had 10 fingers and 10 toes and a full head of dark curly hair. She was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. We held her. We told her how much we loved her, how long we had waited for her, and we named her. We gave her her name, Serafina. I described the funeral, the tiny white casket, the small, almost unnoticeably new headstone in the quietest corner of the old town cemetery. And I described the years that had followed, the quiet, hollow ache of our childless home, the way her name became a secret, a sacred, and a deeply painful word that was never spoken, but was always, always there. We moved on, of course, I continued, my voice now a ragged, exhausted whisper, my story almost complete. We built a life. A good life. But the grief, it doesn't go away, Chloe. It just changes shape. It becomes a part of you. Quiet. Room in your heart that you keep locked. And the name, her name, that's the key to the door. I looked at her, my dear, sweet, and now very pale friend. Her own face was a mess of tears, her eyes full of a deep and I believed a genuine, horrified sympathy. So you see, I said, my confession finally, completely delivered. I don't hate the name, Chloe. I think it is the most beautiful name in the world. It is the name of an angel. I took a deep, shuddering breath. But it is a name that, for me, belongs to a ghost. It belongs to my daughter. The thought of hearing it every day, of saying it, of writing it on a birthday card for another little girl, a beautiful little girl who I will love with all my heart. It would be like living with that ghost for the rest of my life. Would be a constant, unending reminder of the deepest and most painful loss of my life. I leaned forward, my own eyes pleading with hers, a silent, desperate appeal for her. To understand. I am not asking you to change the name, I said, and it was the truth. It was her child, her choice. I would never do that. I am telling you the truth. I am telling you why I cannot celebrate it.
Why?
When? You told me I looked like I had seen a ghost. Because I had. My story was finished. Secret was out. I was emotionally raw, stripped bare, more vulnerable than I had ever been with another human being besides my husband. I had laid the most painful part of my soul at her feet. Chloe just sat there, weeping for a long, silent minute. Then she came over to my chair, knelt on the floor, and wrapped her arms around me in a fierce, tight hug. "Oh, Eleanor," she sobbed into my shoulder. "I had no idea. I am so sorry." "Of course I understand." She pulled back, her eyes full of what I took to be a deep and loving comprehension. "We'll figure something out," she whispered, squeezing my hand. "Of course we will. Don't you worry about a thing." She left a few minutes later after I had insisted I was all right. I was not all right. I was emotionally flayed. But as I watched her walk down my garden path, I felt a profound sense of relief and a fragile, tentative hope. She had understood. My God, she had actually understood. Our friendship was safe. The crisis was averted. She was a good person. She would do the right thing. I had never in my entire life been more wrong. I left Chloe on the porch of my quiet Concord home feeling emotionally flayed, as though I had just voluntarily removed a layer of my own skin. But underneath the raw, exposed vulnerability, there was a fragile and unfamiliar sense of peace. I had shared my heaviest burden. I had spoken the name of my ghost aloud. And my dearest friend, my surrogate daughter, had held me in her arms and promised that she understood. I had allowed myself to believe, for the first time in 40 years, that my grief did not have to be a solitary confinement. The hope, a tender and foolish green shoot in the barren landscape of my past, lasted for exactly 2 days. On a Thursday afternoon, Chloe called. Her voice, which had been full of a tearful, horrified sympathy when she left my house, was now different. It was bright, brittle, and carried an undercurrent of something that sounded unnervingly like practiced cheerfulness. "Hey, Eleanor," she began, her tone the one a person uses when they are about to try and sell you something you don't want. "I'd been thinking a lot about our conversation. And first of all, I just want to thank you again for being so honest with me. It was incredibly brave of you." "Course, darling," I said, a small, cold knot of dread beginning to form in my stomach. This was not the call I had been expecting. "And I've been doing a lot of thinking," she continued, her words now coming in a quick, rehearsed rush. "About the name, about Serafina. And I had the most beautiful idea. I was thinking, maybe this isn't a sad thing at all. Maybe this is a way to honor your Serafina." I was silent, the cold knot in my stomach tightening. "Think about it?" she pressed on, her voice full of a desperate sales pitch enthusiasm. "Her name gets to live on. This beautiful, strong little girl will carry it into the future. It's like, your Serafina gets to have a life through my daughter. It's not about replacing her. It's about remembering her in a positive, life-affirming way. Have you thought of it like that?" I stared at the antique grandfather clock in my hallway. I listened to its slow, steady, and merciless ticking. She had taken my profound personal and lifelong grief, and she had repackaged it. She had turned my dead child into a branding opportunity for her own. "Chloe," I said, my voice dangerously quiet, "my daughter is not a legacy brand you can relaunch. Her memory is not a tribute you can pay. It is a part of me. A part that is still, after 40 years, a source of immense and quiet pain." "That's just it," she said, completely missing the point, or, more likely, deliberately ignoring it. "Maybe it's time for it to stop being painful. Maybe this is a chance for you to heal, to associate the name with something joyful for a change." She let out a small, tinkling laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "I mean, come on, Eleanor. It was 40 years ago. Don't you think it's time to let some of that sadness go?" The condescension, the breathtaking amateur psychoanalysis of my grief was a slap in the face. Gosh. She was not just dismissing my pain. She was diagnosing it as a character flaw, a stubborn refusal to heal on a timeline that was convenient for her. My mind, unbidden, flashed back to another time, another conversation, another moment where my reality had been a profound inconvenience to her desires. Chloe is 22. She is a graduate student, bright and ambitious, and she has just been awarded a prestigious fellowship to study Renaissance art in Florence for a year. It is a life-changing opportunity. It is also the same year as my husband Paul's 60th birthday. Paul, who has been Chloe's mentor, her champion, her surrogate father since she first moved to town, has been planning for years to celebrate this milestone birthday with a trip to Florence. It is his dream to see the Uffizi, to walk across the Ponte Vecchio. When Chloe gets her fellowship news, she is ecstatic. I am ecstatic for her. But a few weeks later, she calls me, her voice full of a manufactured, dramatic sorrow. "Eleanor, I have the most terrible news," she says. "The fellowship. The dates are fixed. I have to be in Florence from September to August. The entire year." She pauses. "That's when Paul's birthday is, isn't it?" "Yes," I say slowly, a sense of dread dawning. "Well, I was thinking," she says, her voice now full of a bright, false hope. "It would be a terrible shame for him to come all that way and not have me there to show him around. I'll know the city so well by then. So maybe he and you could just postpone the trip for a year. Come for his 61st instead. It would be so much more special that way." I am stunned into silence. Man who has been dreaming of this trip for a decade, to postpone the celebration of his own milestone birthday to accommodate her schedule. The sheer unthinking, self-absorbed nature of the request is breathtaking. "Chloe," I say carefully, "that is a very big thing to ask. I know," she says, completely missing the point. "But it will be so worth it. It will be a perfect trip instead of just a good one. He'll understand. Talk to him for me. You're so much better at explaining things." I did. I talked to Paul, and because he was the kindest, most generous man I have ever known, and because he loved Chloe like a daughter, he had agreed. He had postponed his dream.
Okay.
We went the following year. It was a wonderful trip. But it was not. The same in Chloe, who had promised to be our personal tour guide, was so busy with her own friends and her own social life in Florence that we barely saw her. We had rearranged our world to fit into hers, and she had, with a casual, smiling indifference, barely noticed. The memory faded, leaving the familiar bitter taste of a quiet, long-held resentment. Chloe's pattern had not changed. Her desires were a son, and she expected everyone else and their own small, insignificant dreams to be the planets that orbited around her. "Chloe," I said, my voice now cold, the warmth and the vulnerability of our last conversation completely gone. "My grief is not a project for you to manage. It is not an illness for you to cure. It is a fact of my life. And the fact is, the name Serafina is, for me, a name of profound and personal sorrow. And to hear it every day on a child I love, it would be a constant, living torment. I cannot do it." "So what are you saying?" she asked, her own voice now losing its therapeutic patience, replaced by a sharp defensive edge. "You're saying I can't use the name?" "I am saying that if you choose to use that name," I said, choosing my words with a final, painful precision, "you are also choosing to cause me a deep and lasting pain, and you will have to live with that choice. I will have to live with the knowledge that our friendship was not strong enough to stop you from making it." This was her moment. Her chance to be the kind, empathetic, and loving friend I had always believed her to be. Her chance to choose our friendship over her own aesthetic preference. She was silent for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was a stranger's. It was cold, dismissive, and utterly, completely, without compassion. "You know what, Eleanor?" she said, her voice dripping with a cruel, pitying condescension. "I am so sorry for what happened. To you, I truly am. It was a terrible tragedy. But it was 40 years ago. And my baby, my real, living, breathing baby, is happening now. And I will not allow you to cast this this morbid, depressing shadow over the happiest time of my entire life. The blow when it landed was so brutal, so complete, that I could not even breathe. Morbid, depressing shadow. She had taken my greatest loss. It's the most sacred and painful part of my soul, and she had redefined it as a selfish, inconvenient mood spoiler. "You are making my pregnancy," she continued, her voice rising with a righteous, self-absorbed fury. "All about you, all about your ancient sadness. You are not being a supportive friend. You are being unbelievably selfish. And I will not give up the one single perfect name that I have ever loved just because you can't get over something that happened before I was even born." I stood up the phone feeling like a cold, dead thing in my hand. The friendship, our beautiful, unlikely, and treasured friendship, was over. She had just killed it. She had killed it with her selfishness, with her profound and breathtaking lack of empathy. "I see," I said, my voice a hollow whisper. "Thank you for making your position so clear." "Fine," she snapped, now fully embracing her role as the wronged party. "Be that way. But don't expect to be a part of this baby's life if you can't even be bothered to say her name without having a breakdown." She hung up. I stood in the center of my quiet, sunlit living room, the dial tone a shrill, meaningless scream in my ear. The fragile hope I had felt just a few days ago was gone, replaced by the cold, hard, and desolate reality of a betrayal so deep it had left a crater in my soul. I was not just grieving for the daughter I had lost 40 years ago. I was now grieving for the one I had just lost today. And I knew with a sudden, terrible clarity what I had to do. She had told me to get over it. She had told me my daughter's story was ancient history. Fine. I would prove her wrong. I would make my daughter's story the present. I would make it so real, so powerful, and so public that the whole world, and especially our small, quiet town, would have no choice but to remember. The death of a friendship, I discovered, is a peculiar kind of grief. It is a haunting. In the days that followed my disastrous final conversation with Chloe, her ghost was everywhere in my quiet Concord home. I would see the beautiful, illustrated copy of The Little Prince she had given me for my last birthday and feel a fresh, sharp pang of loss. I would be in my garden, tending to the rosebush she had helped me plant, and I would be ambushed by the memory of her laughter. She had not died, but she was gone, and the silence she had left behind was a constant, mournful presence. The anger came and went in waves, but the dominant emotion was a profound, aching sadness. The cruelty of her words echoed in my mind. "You're making my pregnancy all about you? You're still living in the past?" She had taken my deepest trauma, a grief I had carried with a quiet, solitary dignity for 4 decades, and she had reframed it as a selfish, manipulative character flaw. She had not just dismissed my daughter's memory. She had pathologized my love for her. My husband, Paul, was my anchor in this storm of renewed grief. He listened as I replayed the conversation, as I dissected every cruel word, every selfish turn of phrase. His anger on my behalf was a fierce, protective fire. "She's a child, Eleanor," he said one evening, his voice a low, rumbling growl of fury as we sat in our quiet living room. 35-year-old child who has never been forced to confront a single reality that is more important than her own fleeting desires. "What she did to you was not just insensitive, it was a form of psychological violence. She just couldn't see past her own happiness." "Paul?" I said, the librarian in me still trying to find a more charitable interpretation of the text. "No," he said, his voice firm. That's not it. It takes no effort to see another person's pain, especially when they lay it at your feet as vulnerably as you did. It just takes a willingness to look, okay? And she was not willing. She chose not to see you, okay? And that is unforgivable. He was right. I knew he was right. The friendship was over a casualty of a self-absorption so profound it had become a form of blindness. And I knew with a certainty that was as cold and as hard as the granite of New England that I could not let her have the final word. I could not let her or anyone dismiss the memory of my daughter as an ancient sadness. My grief was not ancient. It was a living, breathing part of me. And my daughter, my Seraphina, was not a shadow. She was a story. And it was a story that I now finally had to tell. The catalyst for my decision came on a quiet, rainy afternoon. Always. In my study, sorting through some old papers, when my eyes fell upon the small wooden box on the high shelf. I had not opened it since the day I had shown its contents to Chloe. With a heavy heart, I took it down. I sat at my desk and opened the lid. The few precious artifacts of my daughter's brief life were still there. The tiny hospital bracelet, the lock of hair, the knitted cap, the faded Polaroid. I picked up the small desk calendar I kept, and I flipped the pages. My finger traced the slow, inexorable march of the days until I found it. April 12th. It was 3 weeks away. On that day, 40 years ago, my daughter had been born, and she had died. On that day, this year, she would have turned 40.40, a milestone. An age of maturity, of reflection, of a life fully lived. An age my daughter had never been allowed to reach. And in that moment, a new, clear, and unshakable sense of purpose washed over me. I would not let that day pass in silence. I would not allow my daughter's 40th birthday to be a private, mournful affair. I would honor it. I would celebrate it. And I would, in the process, reclaim her story from the casual, dismissive cruelty of my former friend. My revenge would not be a confrontation. It would not be an angry letter or a bitter phone call. It would be an act of remembrance. It would be a story. I closed the memory box and opened my laptop. For 40 years, I had been a librarian, a custodian of other people's stories. 4. The past few years of my retirement, I had been a genealogist, a meticulous archivist of other people's histories. Now, it was time to tell my own. I began to write. And the process was a painful, terrifying, and profoundly cathartic excavation of my own soul. I did not write with anger. I wrote with a historian's precision and a mother's boundless love. I titled the essay simply, For Seraphina at 40. I started with a photograph, the faded Polaroid of the 2 young, heartbroken people in the hospital bed, holding their silent child. I wrote about the couple in that picture, about their dreams, about their 5-year struggle to start a family in a small, quiet New England town. I wrote about the pure, unadulterated joy of the pregnancy, the feeling of a life quickening inside me, a secret, fluttery conversation between a mother and a child who had not yet met. Then I moved to the hospital bracelet. Baby girl read. This was the hardest part to write. Oh. I forced myself to remember the clinical, terrifying details of that day. I wrote about the sterile smell of the hospital, the increasingly anxious faces of the nurses, the sudden frantic rush to the operating room. I wrote about the silence. The terrible, profound, and unnatural silence that is the sound of a world ending. I did not write with melodrama or self-pity. I wrote with a stark, brutal honesty, the way a war correspondent might describe a battle. It was a battle, and I had lost. From there, I wrote about the knitted cap, and the single impossible, an eternal hour that Paul and I had been given with our daughter. I described her, every perfect, heartbreaking detail. The dark, curly hair, the tiny, perfect rosebud mouth, the impossible weight of her small, still body in my arms. I wrote about the act of naming her, of whispering the name Serafina into. The silent air of that quiet room, a final, desperate act of a mother's love. A name for a soul that was already on its way back to the angels from which it had come. And finally, I wrote about the name itself. I wrote about finding it in an old book, about its meaning, about how it had felt like a piece of magic. And I wrote about what that name had become for me over the past 40 years. A secret, a treasure, a password to the quiet, locked room. In my heart where my daughter still lived. It was not just a name. It was a memorial, a headstone, a story I wrote for 2 weeks. I would write for a few hours, then stop, completely drained, and go and sit in my garden. The quiet beauty of the natural world, unnecessary balm. Then I would go back and write some more. Paul was a quiet, constant, and supportive presence. He would read the pages I had written, his own eyes full of the shared familiar grief. And he would just nod and say, "That's it, Eleanor. That's the truth." When I was finally finished, I had a 10-page, 5,000-word document. It was the most difficult, most painful, and most honest thing I had ever written. It was the story of a mother's love, a daughter's loss, and the quiet, enduring shape of a 40-year grief. It was my heart, translated into prose. Paul read the final draft, his hand holding mine. "It's beautiful, Eleanor," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "It's a perfect tribute to her. What are you going to do with it?" I hadn't thought that far ahead. My initial impulse had been simply to write it, to give form to the grief that Chloe had so casually dismissed. It was an act of personal testimony. But now, holding the finished essay in my hands, I knew that its purpose was not to be a secret. Its purpose was to be read. My daughter's life had been a secret for 40 years. The final greatest act of honoring her memory was to finally, publicly speak her name. My grief did not need to be a private shame. It could be a shared story. "I'm going to publish it," I said, my voice full of a new, quiet, and unshakable resolve. That evening, I sat at my desk and composed a simple, short email to the editor, the Concord Chronicle subject. A submission for consideration, dear editor. My name is Eleanor Reed. I have been a resident of Concord for over 40 years. And I was the head children's librarian at the public library until my retirement 2 years ago. Attached is a personal essay I have written in honor of my late daughter on what would have been her 40th birthday. Thank you for your time and consideration. Sincerely, Eleanor Reed. I attached the document. My finger hovered over the send button. This was the final step. This was the moment my private grief would become a public record. Was it an act of revenge? Was it a calculated move to shame the young woman who had so deeply wounded me? Yes, on some level, it was. But it was also something more. It was an act of a mother's love, a final refusal to allow her child's story to be dismissed, to be forgotten, to be called ancient history. I looked at the small wooden memory box on my desk. I thought of the tiny, perfect child who had lived for only an hour, but who had shaped my entire life. I pressed send. The morning of April 12th arrived, as it had for the past 40 years, with a quiet, solemn weight. It was the day of my daughter's birth and the day of her death, a private, sacred anniversary that my husband Paul and I had always observed in the quiet sanctuary of our own home. But this year was different. This year, Serafina would have. been 40. And this year, for the first time, her story was not going to be a secret. I woke early and checked my email. My heart a tight, nervous knot in my chest. There was a message from the editor of the Concord Chronicle, the local online newspaper to which I had sent my essay. Subject: Your essay, dear Mrs. Reed. I have just finished reading for Serafina at 40. I am a father myself, and I must tell you that I was so profoundly moved, I had to walk away from my desk for a time. It is a work of incredible courage, honesty, and a mother's profound love. It would be an absolute honor to publish your tribute to your daughter on our front page this morning. Sincerely, David Chen. I read the email, a wave of profound, trembling relief washing over me. He had understood. He had not seen the story as a piece of local gossip or a morbid overshare. He had seen it for what it was, a love letter. At precisely 9 a.m., it went live. The front page of the town's most widely read news source was no longer a story about a local zoning dispute or a high school football game. It was a single beautiful professional photograph of me, taken by Paul in our garden, and a simple, powerful headline: A local mother's tribute for Serafina. At 40, Paul and I sat together at our kitchen table, my laptop open between us, and we read the essay together, my own words now rendered in the clean official font of a news publication. Seeing it there, so public and so permanent, was a terrifying and deeply cathartic experience. The story, my story, our story, was no longer a secret, no longer a private grief whispered in the dark. It was a text, a historical record, a part of our town's collective memory. The newspaper, as is the custom, shared the article to the official Concord Community Facebook page. And that is when the ripple effect began. At first, it was a slow, quiet trickle of reactions. A like, a love emoji, a simple one-word comment. Beautiful. Heartbreaking. Then the first share and another. And another. Within an hour, it was a flood. A tidal wave of community emotion that was more powerful, more overwhelming, and more beautiful than I could have ever imagined. The comments section, a space I knew from past experience could be a cesspool of petty arguments and uninformed opinions, transformed into a sacred space. It became a digital wake, a public gathering of shared grief and profound compassion. Eleanor, I worked with you at the library for 15 years, and I never knew. One of my former colleagues wrote, "You carried this with such grace." You for sharing your beautiful Serafina with us? My wife and I lost our own son 20 years ago. A man I vaguely recognized from the hardware store wrote, "No one ever talks about it." Thank you for having the courage to speak the truth of what it is to be a grieving parent. You have given a voice to so many of us. On and on they went, hundreds of comments. People shared their own stories of miscarriage, of stillbirth, of lost children. They offered prayers. They offered support. They offered their own quiet, long-held griefs. The town, our quiet, reserved, and sometimes cold New England town, was collectively opening its heart, creating a vast, supportive, and deeply human tapestry of shared experience. My private, solitary pain had become a catalyst for a community's catharsis. The digital world then spilled into the real one. Around noon, the doorbell rang. It was my next-door neighbor, a woman I had only ever shared polite pleasantries with about the weather. She was standing on my porch with a warm, freshly baked apple pie in her hands, her eyes full of tears. I read your story," she said, her voice thick. "And I just wanted to bring you this." Throughout the afternoon, a quiet, solemn procession of my friends and neighbors came to my door. They brought flowers, they brought casseroles, they brought cards. They did not stay long. They would just give my hand a squeeze, their eyes communicating a deep, unspoken understanding, and then they would leave. They were not there to pry. They were there to pay their respects, to mourn a child of Concord who had been a secret for 40 years in the midst of this overwhelming, beautiful, and deeply moving outpouring. My thoughts kept turning to Chloe. I could only imagine what this day must be like for her. She, who is so enmeshed in the town's social media scene, could not possibly have avoided it. Her own happy, celebratory pregnancy, the one she had accused me of casting a morbid shadow over, was now completely and totally eclipsed by the profound, authentic gravity of my story. No one, I noticed, mentioned her in the comments. No one attacked her. They didn't have to. The shame was not in an accusation. It was in the silence that now surrounded her. Everyone in our small, interconnected town knew that she was my close friend. They knew she was pregnant. And now they knew the story of Serafina. Her plan to name her own daughter Serafina, which she had surely shared with her own circle of friends, was no longer a beautiful, unique choice. It was a monstrous, selfish, and deeply cruel act of appropriation. She had not been attacked. She had simply been revealed. The truth in all its quiet power had rendered her socially radioactive. The confirmation of this came in a text message late that afternoon from a mutual friend. Another librarian. LEMAN. I hope you are feeling all the love the town is sending your way today. Your essay is the most beautiful thing I have ever read. The text paused. I spoke with Chloe this morning. She has seen it. She is not doing well. I don't think she understood. Not really. Until now. I think she finally understands. I read the message and I felt no triumph. No satisfying thrill of revenge. Just a deep, profound, and aching sadness for a friendship that had been so unnecessarily and so tragically lost. That evening, just as the sun was beginning to set, Paul and I drove to the cemetery. The old hill burying ground is a beautiful, peaceful place. Its ancient, weathered headstones a testament to the town's long history. In the quietest, most secluded corner, under the shade of a massive 400-year-old oak tree, was the small, simple, white marble stone. Serafina, April 12, 1985. I had brought a small bouquet with me. 40 perfect, white, long-stemmed roses. I knelt and placed them in the small vase at the base of the stone. For 40 years, this had been a private, lonely pilgrimage, a quiet conversation between a mother and the ghost of her child. But today, I did not feel alone. I felt surrounded by the quiet, compassionate presence of my entire community. I took out my phone and I opened the comments section of the article one last time. And I began to read the stories, the messages of love and of loss aloud to my daughter. Your story, my sweet girl, I whispered. My voice a soft murmur in the quiet evening air is finally being told. My revenge on Chloe was complete. She would, I was sure, quietly choose another name for her daughter. Not out of a sudden, miraculous surge of empathy, but because the social cost of using the name Serafina in this town was now, and would forever, be too high. But my real victory was not in her defeat. It was here, in this quiet, sacred place. I had taken back my daughter's name. I had washed it clean of the casual, selfish appropriation and re-sanctified it with the story of a mother's undying love. I had ensured that my daughter, who had lived for only an hour, would now live forever in the memory of our town. Her story, which had been my private burden, was now our shared history. And she was, at last, no longer a secret. Of course. Here is an additional chapter to serve as a final, extended epilogue to Eleanor's story, exploring the quiet, long-term consequences of her public act of remembrance. Underscore. Act Vi. The olive branch the summer that followed that difficult spring was one of the most beautiful I can remember in Concord. My garden, as if sensing the profound shift in my own emotional landscape, produced a riot of impossibly vibrant flowers. The quiet, solitary peace I had once cultivated as a defense mechanism was gone, replaced by a new, more open and connected tranquility. My story was no longer a secret, and in sharing it, I found that the heavy 50-pound weight of my grief had been transformed into something I could carry with a surprising lightness. The town, for its part, had changed in its relation to me. The polite, respectful distance my neighbors had always afforded me was replaced by a new warmth, a new empathy. People would stop me in the grocery store, not to offer pity, but to share a quiet, knowing look. Silent acknowledgement of the shared human experience of loss. I had become, in a strange and unexpected way, not a figure of tragedy, but a symbol of resilience. My quiet, scholarly life had been cracked open, and what the community found inside was not weakness, but a quiet, enduring strength. Of Chloe, I heard almost nothing. I saw her once, from a distance, pushing a stroller at the farmer's market. She looked tired, as all new mothers do, but she also looked smaller, diminished. The bright, confident, almost aggressive effervescence she had always carried was gone, replaced by a quiet, self-conscious hesitancy. She saw me, her eyes widened for a fraction of a second, and she immediately turned and walked down a different aisle, a quiet, public admission of a shame she could not yet face. I learned, through the gentle, ever-turning mill of town gossip, that she had had her baby, a healthy girl, and she had not, of course, named her Seraphina. She had named her Grace, a simple, beautiful, and almost painfully appropriate name. A name that was, in itself, a quiet, unspoken apology. I did not reach out. The wound was too deep, the betrayal too profound. I had reclaimed my daughter's story, and I had found a new, quiet peace in my life. And I believed, with a somber finality, that this new peace did not have room for the person who had so casually, so cruelly tried to disrupt it. I believed our story was over, but the past, as I, a historian, should have known better than anyone, is never truly over. The letter arrived on a warm, humid afternoon in late August. It was not a formal, typed letter. It was a single sheet of notebook paper folded into a simple envelope, with my name written on the front in Chloe's familiar, loopy, and now slightly hesitant handwriting. It had been left in my mailbox, not sent through the post. It's a quiet, personal delivery. I sat on my porch for a long time, the letter unopened in my lap. My husband Paul watching me with a quiet, supportive concern from the doorway. My first instinct was to tear it up, to refuse this new intrusion. My curiosity and the faint, ghostly echo of the deep love I had once felt for the woman who had written it won out. I opened it. The letter was not what I expected. It was not a litany of excuses. It was not a demand for forgiveness. It was a confession. A long, rambling, and deeply, painfully honest one. Dear Eleanor, it began, I don't know if you will even read this. I wouldn't blame you if you threw it away. I have been trying to write this letter for 3 months, and I still don't know what to say. There are no words, I think, to properly apologize for the person I was, for the things I said to you. I have read your essay about Seraphina 100 times. I have it saved on my phone. Sometimes I read it in the middle of the night, when my own daughter is sleeping on my chest and I weep. Not just for you and for the beautiful, perfect daughter you lost, but for my own breathtaking, monstrous blindness. I thought I understood that day in your living room. I felt sad for you, but I didn't understand. I saw your grief as a story, a sad story from the past that was getting in the way of my own happy story in the present. It was an inconvenience, an obstacle to my own happiness. And that is the ugliest, most shameful truth of my entire life. And then Grace was born. And the moment the doctor placed her in my arms, the moment I looked at her tiny, perfect face, my entire world, the entire selfish, self-absorbed universe I had built around myself, it shattered. I felt a love so profound, so fierce, so all-consuming that it was terrifying. It was an animal love. It's a primal need to protect this tiny, helpless person from all the pain in the world. And in that single, overwhelming moment of becoming a mother, I finally understood what you had lost. I held my daughter, my beautiful, living, breathing daughter, and all I could think about was you. 40 years ago, holding yours in that silent hospital room, and the cruelty of my own actions, of my telling you to get over it, of my dismissing your daughter's memory as an ancient sadness. It came crashing down on me with a force that was almost physical. I have never felt so ashamed. See, now that you are not trying to cast a shadow on my happiness, you are trying to protect the sacred memory of your own. You were a mother, protecting your child. And I was the one who could not see it. The town looks at me differently now. I know they do. I have become a cautionary tale, the selfish girl who broke the kind librarian's heart. And I deserve it. I deserve all of it. I am not writing this to ask for your forgiveness. I don't think I have earned that. And I am not writing to ask to be your friend again. I know with a deep and abiding sadness that the beautiful, uncomplicated thing we once had is gone forever. I broke it. I am writing this for a single reason. I am writing this to say that I finally see you. I see your Serafina, not as a story, not as a sad memory, but as your daughter, a real person who was loved and who is still so deeply loved. I see her. And I am so profoundly and eternally sorry, Chloe. I finished the letter, my own tears now blurring the ink of hers. The letter was a gift, a painful, beautiful, and completely unexpected gift. It was not an apology designed to make her feel better. It was a confession designed to let me know that I had finally been heard. My revenge, the quiet public act of publishing my daughter's story, had been a complete and total success. It had not just shamed Chloe into silence, it had, it seemed, awakened her. It had forced her into a confrontation with her own selfishness, and in doing so had opened the door to her own empathy. It had, in the end, made her a mother. Paul came and stood behind me, his hands resting on my shoulders. "What does it say?" he asked gently. "It says," I whispered, my voice thick with 100 different, complicated emotions, "that she is sorry and that she finally understands." He was quiet for a long time. "What are you going to do?" I thought about it. I thought about the broken friendship, the deep and lasting wound of her betrayal. And I thought about the new mother, sitting in her own quiet house across town, grappling with the new, terrifying, and beautiful reality of a love that was bigger than herself. The old friendship was dead. That was a fact. But perhaps in the ashes of the old, something new, something different could be planted the next day. I walked to the town's independent bookstore, the one where I had spent so many happy hours of my life. I went to the children's section. I did not buy a book about angels or mythology. I chose a simple, classic, and deeply profound story of love and loss and what it means to be real. I bought a beautiful cloth-bound illustrated edition of The Velveteen Rabbit. I took it home, and on the inside cover, I wrote a simple two-line inscription: "For Grace, may all your stories be happy ones." And I signed it simply, "With love, Eleanor." I wrapped the book in simple brown paper and tied it with a piece of twine. I did not include a letter for Chloe. My reply was the book itself. That afternoon, I walked through the quiet, familiar, and beautiful streets of Concord. I walked to Chloe's house, a small, charming cape on a street not far from my own. Did not knock. I did not ring the bell. I just quietly, gently placed the small, wrapped package on her front porch, leaning it against the door. It was not an act of forgiveness. Not yet. It was not an offer of a renewed, unbroken friendship. It was something smaller and perhaps more important. It was an acknowledgement of her apology. It was a gift for an innocent, beautiful little girl named Grace. And as I walked away, back towards my own quiet, peaceful home, I felt the last, heavy, and most painful chapter of my life finally, quietly, and completely come to a close. I was no longer the grieving mother. I was no longer the avenging friend. I was, as I had always been, the librarian, offering one last perfect story, a story of what it means to become real through the difficult and often painful magic of love.